Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Stranger Things Season 2. I've been there, done that, and I've got the t-shirt. And this episode is going to be an in-depth review of Season 2 and why I think Season 2 is really just doesn't hold up as well as what Season 1 did. Let me start by saying that I really love Stranger Things Season 1. I thought it was a great show. It was creative. There was a freshness about it. It's one of those things that comes along every now and then and becomes a phenomenon. And it really was a TV phenomenon. We haven't had one of those in a while. There was nostalgia. There was fun. It had a good story. It wasn't perfect, but it was a pretty good and enjoyable watch. Season 2 was always going to struggle with what I call the bigotry of high expectations. Once the bar is set high, whether it's a film or a television series, and maybe there's a lot of hype surrounding it, or you've read a lot of really positive reviews, so you set your expectations up here. In this case, we'd had a previous series. Really, as I said, it was a worldwide global phenomenon, Stranger Things, Season 1. And so it set the bar really high. And so Season 2 was always going to have to deal with this bigotry of high expectations. People who go into it expecting the same pleasure and enjoyment they got out of Season 1, and if it's not quite there, they get really angry and upset about it and perhaps are overly critical, even though if Season 1 didn't exist, you would still think, well, Season 2 was a pretty amazing TV series all by itself. The problem was, though, that I think that, and I'll get more into this in this episode, Season 2 wasn't as strong. If you took away Season 1 and just watched Season 2 on its own, Season 1 perhaps was just a backstory they told you at the beginning. This was the first time you'd ever been introduced to Stranger Things. I don't think it holds up as well. It's just not as strong. I'll explain more as we go. Obviously, this episode is going to have spoilers in it. So if you haven't seen Stranger Things 2 yet, you haven't watched the entire series, there are going to be spoilers in this episode. So maybe, if you don't want those, switch it off now, go and watch it, and then come back later. If you have seen the series or you don't mind the spoilers, then this episode's going to be probably a little bit longer as we go into a little bit more depth about why I think it doesn't hold up as well as Season 1. Before I get into that, though, I always like to start with the positives, so I'm going to do that for Stranger Things 2. And here are some of the things that I actually liked. I liked the introduction of Sean Astin and Paul Reiser. I thought that was a nice little touch. Using those actors, these are guys who really cut their teeth in the 80s. Sean Astin was a child actor in the 80s, and here he is back in this sort of 80s throwback childhood adventure series. I thought it was cool. It was a nice touch, and the character they gave him to play was it was really cool to see him in that sort of role again. Paul Reiser, the company man from Aliens, and here he is back again, and he's effectively a company man again, and again, as I said, it was a nice touch. I really thought that was great. I love some of the little plot devices in this. I thought there was some clever little plot devices. Not everything was good, but I did like some of them. One of the things I really liked, just picking out one example, is I loved the fact that you could see the outline of the monster from the Upside Down world in the static. When Will's mum pauses the video and you see in the static, she gets the trace paper and she traces over the screen and she gets the outline of the monster. I thought that was really cool. I don't know why, but I really liked that. I thought that was a really cool little plot device. Simple, but a great way to do it. And there's lots of ways they could have done that, but I thought it was a creative one. I can't think of anything else where I've seen that, perhaps that sort of version or variation of that idea of something being caught on camera. As I said, there's lots of other ways they could have done that, but there was a little creativity, a spark of creativity that just gave it a bit of uniqueness there. The visuals in this, again, the visuals are awesome. There's some really cool visuals. I loved, particularly in those final couple of episodes when they I love the visuals throughout, and I love the lighting. There's one episode that's a bit of an exception, but I love the lighting throughout this and the visuals throughout. But I think particularly those last couple of episodes where the series reaches its crescendo, particularly the stuff down in the tunnels. There was some really cool little visuals there. There's one scene earlier on where Hopper is walking towards the hole to dig the hole, and he's got the shovel hanging over, or the spade hanging over his back. And there's this beautiful shot, this camera shot, tracking him from behind and looking up. and it was sort of reminiscent of almost the gravedigger, or the executioner going to prepare a grave for the person who's about to be executed. It just had that sort of dark sort of beauty to it, and there's lots of little cool visuals in this that I thought were really, really awesome, particularly towards the end. As I said, those shots in the tunnel, and I loved the costuming in this one, particularly towards the end when the kids go down as a group into the tunnels. And I thought that was, I don't know why, but it really appealed to me, the goggles and the bandanas they were wearing around their faces, and that whole look, everything just looked really visually quite nice. The child acting and the directing is still, I think, it is good in this. Look, there's little moments here or there, but overall, it's still up to that high standard that we got out of season 1. And it's interesting because you've got a guy like Finn Wolfhard, who's in both Stranger Things, and he was in the recent movie adaptation of It. It, I don't think, is a great example of child acting. There's some sort of really glaring issues with some of the child acting and directing in that. If you haven't already seen it, I did a more comprehensive review of it a couple of weeks ago, and you can go and watch that if you want to on the channel. But this series, Stranger Things 2, the child acting and directing is good. And child acting and directing is not easy. It's not even so much often about the child acting. It's about how you time your shots, because they perhaps lack the acting experience and expertise to be able to hold their character, as long as you need them to, so you can sort of hang on the shot that little bit longer. And so you have to cut away a lot quicker, and you have to be careful about how you shoot child actors, particularly when they're in groups. But in this, it worked, and it worked really well. Dustin is still my favourite. I love Dustin. I think he's the king of the series. He still works really well. I think one of the potential dangers here was that Dustin would get a little bit tiring. That style of humour and quirkiness and that sort of lovable oafishness that he brings to the series. It could have been overplayed, and I think it's one of the things in this series that wasn't actually overplayed. They did overplay some things, but they didn't with his character, and Dustin is really great. I think he's one actor who's actually, I think, has got a very, very promising career ahead of him. He's one of those guys who, for possibly a lot of people watching the series, it may not seem like it for a whole lot of reasons, but I actually think he's probably going to be one of the actors who really does go on, and who's going to show and prove perhaps to a lot of people, and even surprise some people, I think, with his acting ability and acting range. I think out of anyone, I think he really is perhaps the Sean Astin of that group in many ways. So, look, there's lots of things to like about it, and it's still overall, there was things that I really enjoyed about this. It wasn't like 9 episodes of boredom and slogging through really bad TV. It's not really bad. The problem is it just doesn't reach the heights of what season 1 did. And you could say, well, part of that is perhaps, again, that bigotry of high expectations. But I think it's actually more than that. And so what I want to do now is I want to look at some of the things that I think were problematic about Series 2. I think in this one, particularly in the early stages, to me it sort of almost feels like two different series from the beginning, the first 4 episodes or so, to the second half of the season, the last 4 or 5, apart from one episode, episode 7. We'll talk about episode 7 a bit later on, because that really is the outlier here. But it felt almost like two different series, or tonally it shifted, and it really did get better towards the end of the series. But towards the beginning in particular, it felt to me like there was just too many 80s references in this series. Now, obviously they're in the first season as well, but this one, it felt like they were playing them up, particularly in the first couple of episodes. It was just, some of it was subtle. So a great example of a subtle 80s reference was, I think it might have been the first or second episode, it might have even been, where Will's older brother comes home and he's got the 3 videos that he's hired from the video store, and they're in the classic 80s white video cases that you used to get videos in. And if you've never hired video cassettes from the local video store in the 1980s, you probably won't understand or appreciate this, but it was a subtle little callback to the 80s that really was it was a great piece of subtle nostalgia. Those who were around and hired videos or had parents who did that, you remember your parents coming home with those bland-looking video cassette cases. They didn't even have colour or even black and white photocopied images on them. They just had written on the side of them what they were. And the colour case always stayed back at the VHS rental store. And so that was subtle. That was great. Then, though, in that same episode, I think it is when they're having, Nancy and Steve are having dinner with Barb's parents. And, oh man, the KFC. That's right, boom, here's this bucket of KFC. And to top it off, we even have a reference to it's finger looking good. And it was just like, no, like there was just a lot of stuff that just, it felt too forced. One thing that really stuck out to me was the Ghostbusters reference. I think there's a way they could have done that, and it wasn't the end of the world, the use of the Ghostbusters, but there were some things about it that I found a little bit jarring. So, first of all, the way that Ghostbusters was used, Ghostbusters was actually released that same year. In fact, this series is set in October, late October '84. Ghostbusters, I think from memory, is about June of '84. So at that stage, it's only a few months old. And there seems to be a hype around it that even the adults understand what Ghostbusters is. And I just, I was around then as a kid. I was 9. And I just don't quite remember it being that hype so quickly. It feels how we would treat a movie today. It was a great film and there was a lot of hype about it. But the other thing that particularly really I think for me stuck out was the fact that the age of these kids, it didn't come out on VHS until I think it was 85. So it's like a year later, almost a year later, it comes out on VHS. So it just seems a bit strange to me that whether or not they were old enough to have actually gone to the movie theatres, whether their parents would have actually taken them or let them see it at the movie theatres, and if they didn't, why they were so connected to Ghostbusters. And on top of that, you could get away with that. You can excuse that. Please understand, people might be accusing me of nitpicking. Look, I love the Ghostbusters reference. It was a cool little 80s throwback, but what really, the jarring part actually was some of the stuff around it. So first of all, the way they are talking about Ghostbusters, these young kids, the way they're talking about the character of Winston, that was not an 80s piece of commentary on Ghostbusters or the character of Winston who was in Ghostbusters. That's something that people my age now look back on Ghostbusters and critique and talk about it in that way. When we were kids, we just loved the whole thing. And so it was kind of out of place that these kids are talking about the character of Winston. And not only that, but the sister who calls them nerds at one point for liking Ghostbusters. And I remember that was something I found really jarring. It's like, what are you talking about? Even little kids her age who got exposed to Ghostbusters, it was this thing that took off. And it was like, wow, Ghostbusters, it's awesome. And so it's strange that she would be calling them nerds. Again, that's something you might do today to someone who really loved that first Ghostbusters film and who's a real big fan of it right here and right now. You might call someone today a nerd, but back in the 80s, Ghostbusters was not a nerdy pursuit at all. And so it was a bit jarring. Some of the 80s references, they just got a bit over top. And related to that, I felt there were too many 80s songs in this series. It's great to use 80s songs and they're a good little reference, and some of them were well used, but I just felt there was too many of them and a lot of them weren't. In fact, one or two of them even I felt were just really cliched uses of 80s music. One of the things about the first series that was so good, I think, was the use of the synth soundtrack, and also it just felt like there was a lot more silence. But in this series, it felt like there was these obligatory 80s songs they kept forcing into the series at moments where you look back on and you think, maybe they could have just used a synth track or just had silence in there even. It's just like, why? I don't know, is someone in the studio saying we need to get a soundtrack out, a compilation soundtrack, so quick, get as many songs as you can in there? And some of them were not subtle. That's the other frustrating thing. I like it when you use music well. I'm a musician myself, and I like it when music is used well, and there's a way in which you can use music well in scoring a movie. I'm talking here about pop songs. And the way in which they are used as a more subtle reference to what's going on, as opposed to she's a little runaway when 11 is running away. Like, to me, it's just like hitting you over the head with a brick bat. It was like, no, that's not how you do it. And so I just found that really jarring. In the first series, it just really wasn't an issue at all. I think some of the characterization here, I found a little bit odd. And the character development, I think, was a mixed bag. Especially since, I'll talk more about this later, but especially, it sort of felt like those first couple of episodes, there was a total disconnect. In fact, watching that first couple of episodes and those characters that we know and love, and having known already what they've already been through, you would expect a bit more of a darkness to them, or they're almost experiencing like PTSD, some of them, from this horrific, otherworldly sort of horror experience they've been through, but they don't. They're not experiencing that. In fact, they seem like the same old gang. In fact, to the point where I actually thought maybe I was watching a dream sequence in that first episode, or maybe it was an alternate timeline, or it was a flashback to events that happened before the previous events. It was that's how to me tonally it just felt a little bit odd. Like I would expect them to be a little bit more serious after having been through such traumatic events. And I also, some of the characters, they felt like walking cliches. We'll talk more about Max's brother Billy in a minute, but so Billy and the thugs at that party was one example. They just felt like really bad 80s cliches. It was like, why? Because I don't remember it really being like that in the first series. There was nothing, look, there was lots of nostalgia, but it didn't feel like anything was that badly one-dimensional and cliched in the way it was presented. But in this series, particularly that party scene, and particularly Billy's character, it just felt a bit odd. And there were things about some of the acting and directing and storytelling. I want to give you a list of examples now so you know that I'm not just sort of exaggerating things, and maybe there was only really one or two moments and I've completely blown this out of proportion. There's an incident that happens in episode 3 where the character of Max is pulled off her skateboard by 11. There's a bit of jealousy there. And Max turns around and she has this piece of clunky dialogue that she delivers because she was circling around him on her skateboard. Then all of a sudden 11 causes her skateboard just to come to a grinding halt, and she obviously falls off. And Max turns around and she says something like, "Oh, it was just like a magnet or something pulling on my board. I know that sounds crazy." And I was like, it just felt so clunky and unnatural that like kids, let alone anybody else, but kids just wouldn't talk like that and wouldn't. Why would she think to tell him that? There would be no reason for her to make that comment, especially since they're only really just starting to get to know each other as well. It was just clunky. There was bits of dialogue like that throughout the series that were just really clunky. Episode 2, when Nancy gets drunk at the party, it was just like, it was like, what? Where is this coming from? Why is she now suddenly acting like the trapped girlfriend when it's not really, like there's little hints of it, but it's not really set up in the preceding scenes that she's trapped here in this relationship. Hopper and 11, when they have their fight in the cabin, this is in episode 4, and she really starts to let loose with her powers. He's not scared in the slightest, and he should be scared. Because either he's never experienced this before and he would be scared by it because it would be a totally unknown phenomenon to him, or we know he has experienced this before. He knows who 11 is and what she's capable of. And so equally, he should be really freaked out when she starts using her powers. And he's just not. He carries on arguing as if she's a normal girl. And it didn't feel right again. It feels clunky. It actually feels like he really should be scared of her at that point, but he just wasn't. There's a line that's delivered in episode 4 by Paul Reiser's character, the chief scientist, where he says something along the lines of, he's talking about the alien, that portal opening. He says something along the lines of, but what if a foreign state, let's say the Soviets, heard about our mistake? And again, this is just clunky dialogue, because in the 80s, the only foreign state that Americans really worried about were the Soviets. They were locked in the Cold War. So he wouldn't have said a foreign state like the Soviets. That's something we'd say today. Back then, they would have said, what if the Soviets found out about it? There wouldn't have even been any other possible foreign state that they would have thought about. It was literally America versus Russia, or the West versus Russia, communism versus capitalism. And it was very much this, single two-player dichotomy. And so once again, clunky. Jonathan and Nancy and their romance. Oh, in episode 6, I was watching it and I remember thinking to myself, did someone actually, one of the production team say, what I really like? I love the American version of The Office. And I really love that whole clumsy romance between Jim and Pam. Can we put a bit of a comedic romance into this series? Let's get Nancy and Jonathan with a comedic sort of romance thing happening, and we'll plonk it right in episode 6. And there's this weird conspiracy theory guy who actually is really weird and creepy when he is telling them that they should go and share this bed together. It was just like, what is this? It did not feel organic. It did not feel like it was flowing naturally out of the story. It just felt so forced. And in the end, it doesn't really go anywhere again. It just was so out of place. The scene with the blowtorch and Will, when Paul Reiser is first figuring out, it's episode 6, when he's first figuring out that that Will is connected to this whole, hive mind, alien monster creature from the other side. And so he gets that piece of tentacle, and they get the blowtorch, and he puts the blowtorch on it, and sure enough, Will reacts to that, and he reacts with pain, and that tells him that they are connected. There's a symbiotic sort of connection here. There's a relationship between the two of them. But here's the thing, like what I found jarring about it, it's a little thing I know, but Paul Reiser is this chief scientist in this top-level government agency, and they've already been well established through Series 1 as being, this really dedicated and scientifically committed group of experts. And then all of a sudden he does something so unscientific as bringing the tentacle into the same room as where Will is, and then applying the blowtorch where he can see it, and effectively what that means is that Will could have been faking the whole time. Like, it's just not a very scientific thing to do, and I'm not a scientist, and I know it really stuck out to me, and we're all so familiar with this now. We see it in movies and TV all the time, basic scientific parameters and controls. All they needed to do to fix that scene too was to just have like a two-way mirror, split room, and Paul Reiser and the parents are behind the two-way mirror. Will is on the other side in the room next door. He can't see them. They bring in the aquarium with the tentacle in it, they apply the blowtorch, and they watch Will react. And it's like, scientific hypothesis has been proved, and it's simple, but they don't. Episode 8, why are they all crying when they're sharing those memories and recollections with Will? They've got him tied down in that place, so he's hidden away, he doesn't know where he is, and then they start sharing their recollections with him. Why are they all crying? Maybe the mother, that would make sense, but the older brother, his mate, particularly what they're sharing, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And then from that point, they actually start sharing other things with them, and all of a sudden the emotion completely goes. I just remember thinking at the time, why is this so emotional? This doesn't really make a lot of sense. This is not really an emotional sequence. It shouldn't have that sort of level of emotion in it. At the end of that same episode, episode 8, why did they have that big build-up for the arrival of Eleven outside, with the demi-dogs? And then as soon as that demi-dog came flying through the window, it was obvious for us as an audience what was going on. Eleven was back. She's the only possible character who could have done that, right? So there is no surprise, no anticipation anymore. And yet, lo and behold, they build it up with suspense. And it's not really for the character's sake. I mean, they don't know she's about to arrive, but we do. So why build it up with that suspense? And it really is being built up for our sake, but we already know it's her. So it just didn't make a lot of sense. And then closely related to that, at the start of episode 9, why does Mike become so irrationally emotional with Hopper when he finds out about Eleven? Like, I can understand him being emotional about finding out about Eleven, but And also, it just doesn't seem to go anywhere. It's just this weird emotional outburst. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. And it's like, why would he hate him? He's got no reason to hate him. Billy, who's Max's brother, Maxine's brother, and Karen, Nancy's mum. what was up with that scene in episode 9 where she's having a bath reading her romance novel and she comes downstairs and there's Billy, and it was like, what is going on here with this mother, daughter's friend type weird crush romance thing? It's like, what is this moment of lust even doing in this series? It's totally out of context. It's more, I guess it's more played for comedic value than seriousness. It's totally out of character for both of these characters. I think it's really out of character, and it's totally out of place tonally with what's going on. We're in the final episode now of series 2. We're really reaching a crescendo, and all of a sudden there's this, and Billy's character all of a sudden becomes the serious and sort of manipulative, suave character, when the rest of the series he's been a buffhead. Sure, he's got the power to manipulate. I could quite easily imagine that, but why has he suddenly become suave when the rest of it he's just been a thug? And related to that, Billy, I think, is a classic example of one of the big problems with the series. Why does Billy even need to be in Stranger Things 2 when you think about it? You get to the end of the series and you realise Max, his sister, she's a pivotal character and has good character development and is well utilised. But Billy, when you think about it, you could take him completely out of the series and it wouldn't make any difference at all. In fact, this guy, I found him really frustrating as a character. I think instead of calling him Billy, they could have easily called him cliche Deus Ex Machina, because that's the two things he does. He is constantly doing cliched things. And when he's not doing that, he's acting as a Deus Ex Machina plot device. Oh, we need someone to beat one of the characters up. Let's just use that Billy guy. When you think about it, his whole subplot really does go nowhere and is totally redundant. You just don't need it. The other thing too was the government agency, the secretive, covert, scientific government agency from Series 1, which really was a threat. They were a nemesis to the good guys. They were nefarious. They were killing people for Pete's sake in Series 1. And now all of a sudden, they have become the friendly face of government bureaucracy. Now, I liked Paul Reiser in this. I actually liked his character. But when you think about it, it is totally inconsistent for what that organisation has been established to be. Why would an organisation that has allowed a character like the character played by Matthew Modine in the first series, who's this nefarious, evil genius, and he's clearly allowed to run this organisation in this like an evil genius, shadowy, horrible government organisation that you don't want to have anything to do with. And then all of a sudden we've got this Paul Reiser character who's it's more like your local hospital. It felt so inconsistent. It was like, why have they done this? The government agency felt wrong in this. And I guess maybe again it's a bit of Deus Ex Machina, because they needed the characters to be able to move a bit more freely in and out of where the portal is to the other world. And so they thought, how do we, give them easy access to this government facility? Maybe they become friends, and they're going back and forth. It was sort of like a weird halfway house when you think about it, because Paul Reiser and the other scientists are keeping track of Will. They're doing regular checkups on him. So clearly they still have this sort of investment in their project and its protege, etc. But it was sort of weird. They've suddenly become this, as I said, it just felt like a medical clinic. And it felt wrong. Episode 7. We need to talk about episode 7, my friends, because episode 7 was just awful. Honestly, look, I could create a whole video just talking about episode 7. Why is all I'll say. Why? The acting was not great. The scripting, the dialogue was not the best. That little mini story they constructed within the series, not great. Roman is set up. She's teased at the very start of series 2. We have Roman and her gang. She is set up for a big future payoff. You're like, wow, there's another one like 11, and she's got amazing powers just like 11. And you think, man, I wonder what the payoff's going to be. And episode 7 was the payoff we got. And you're like, what was that? There was no payoff basically at all. Roman, again, didn't need to be in this series at all. She serves no real meaningful purpose. Even the supposed sort of Jedi training that she gives to Eleven, you stop and think about it. She did not actually help Eleven in any meaningful way. She didn't teach Eleven how to do new things that she didn't already know how to do. All she told her was imagine someone that you really hate and harness your powers that way. But we've already seen Eleven harness her powers. She closed the portal and saved the day at the end of Series 1. We saw her, you remember, she's got her in this, in episode 7, Roman is helping her to pull a big railway carriage towards her with her powers, but we've already seen her do things that are far more spectacular than that. Remember, she flipped a vehicle over the top of the heads of the kids at one point. Like, her powers, we've already seen them do and act in ways that are far more amazing than this. So Roman didn't actually help her at all. There's really nothing impressive about this, and it's just all so pointless. And not only that, but so it's a terrible payoff, and it's just tonally inconsistent with the rest of the series. The acting was not great in that episode. The storytelling was not good. Basically, when I was watching this, I thought to myself, I wonder if this is a setup, whether they are trying to set up a spin-off series with Roman and her gang. Because for my way of thinking, that's the only reason you would put this shocking episode 7 into the series. Because it's just, it wasn't good. It really wasn't good. There was no real payoff. However, if you're trying to set up a breakaway franchise so you can make lots more of those dollar bills, y'all, then this is probably a very clumsy way of doing it. And unfortunately, a lot of film and TV now is like that. It's just clumsy and it's all about the money. And so this is how you would do that. So I couldn't help but wonder whether that's really what's going on here, because this was not great. If I was to summarize Series 2 and why I think it wasn't as good as Series 1, I would say this. I would say it feels like they are telling a slightly different version of the exact same story. In fact, a lot of the same story beats we see again in this series that we've already seen previously. And one of the things that was so good about Series 1 was it felt like a movie that had been broken down into a TV series. They took their time telling the story, right? And so Series 2, you expected a new and fresh story that they would do the same thing, but instead it was like they just went back to some of those same beats. And it didn't feel like a new movie really at all. It felt a little bit like, ironically, what Ghostbusters 2 was to Ghostbusters, the original. It was sort of just a rehashing, a bit of an inferior rehashing of the same story. Some of the storytelling design, I'll call it, is a little bit odd. The non-linear flashbacks, the way in which they are placed in the sequence of the storytelling in the series, it was just a bit like, why did they put that there? This surely should have come earlier. The one thing that was really jarring was episode 7, and what didn't help was it's not a particularly good or strong episode. But to all of a sudden interrupt your big crescendo, because the real strength of this series, Series 2, is the tail end of it. It's really, the strongest part is episode 6, 8, and 9. And episode 7 is plonked right in at the point when that crescendo is built, and to a really good point. It's really starting to sizzle. And then we get this episode 7, this sort of, let's flash back a little bit and tell that story. And there are other examples of that as well. I remember thinking, why are these non-linear storytelling flashbacks here? I feel like maybe they should have come earlier, or they should have been utilised differently. Sean Astin's death was really, really frustrating. Look, I liked Sean Astin in this, and I thought it was great. They gave him a great little character to play too, and I thought it was a really nice touch. But it was pretty obvious very early on in the series for me that they were probably going to kill his character. So it was telegraphed quite early on what was coming, and that was frustrating. I don't like it when storytelling is that blatantly obvious, because what made it so obvious was clearly they were trying to develop a romance between Hopper and Will's mum. Look, you could see this is what they're trying to do here. And at that point you realise, okay, well, Sean Astin's a bit of an inconvenience then, isn't he? So there's really only one of two ways this can go. Either Sean Astin really has to get killed, or Sean Astin has to turn out to be an evil bad guy or coward of some kind, so you end up hating him. And that's the only way that you can really, in a very satisfying way, pave the way for the romance that they want to establish here between Hopper and Will's mum. And it was obvious as they were going that he probably wasn't going to be a bad guy. They were just building him up too much in a way that made it clear. At one point I did wonder, maybe they're going to put that really shocking twist that he's actually going to be working for the government. Now that would have been interesting, but they didn't do that. And so I was angry when he died because it just felt like his character, who I thought was really well developed through the series, and I thought had heaps of potential to go on and to be built up to really strengthen this story even into Series 3. And they just used him effectively as a plot device. And it felt frustrating, and particularly, as I said, because I saw it coming. To me, it was just obvious very early on that this was coming. I think basically the Series 2 of Stranger Things is not as tight as Series 1. It lacks some of the subtlety in storytelling that Series 1 had. Now, Series 1 wasn't perfect, but I think it was far better than Series 2. I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the lack of subtlety. So there's that scene where Sean Astin tells Will that he should stand up to the monster in his nightmares. You know, he's telling him his own story about when he was a kid and he was scared about the clown. And then one of his dreams, he just decided to stand up to the clown, and then he had no more nightmares after that. And he says, you should do the same thing to the monster in your dreams. And then they have the scene of him standing up to the monster, and Will is there saying, go away, I'm not scared of you, sort of thing, and doing his big, heroic stand against the monster. And the monster, of course, grabs him. But what they do is they have this really unsubtle flashback to Sean Astin, to the scene we've already seen where he's telling him again, remember, stand up. It's like, why are you doing this Obi-Wan Kenobi moment here? Luke, use the Force. It's like, you don't need this. It's only really quite recent that we will remember this, where Sean Astin told him to stand up to the bad guys in his dream. And it was such a well-constructed moment when he's telling him his own clown nightmare story that, it was memorable enough. You didn't need to have this really unsubtle flashback. They do it again at the end, the end of the season, episode 9, where 11 is sealing up the portal. And all of a sudden we get this flashback to Roman telling her to channel her hate. And I remember thinking, why? We don't need that. This moment is already perfect. We understand and know everything we need to know about her motivations and what's going on in her head. We don't need an unsubtle flashback, and yet that's what they gave us. It's almost like that flashback with Roman at the very end. It was almost like maybe they were worried that people would be a lot more angry if they didn't give some sort of very minimal justification for why they needed episode 7 in the series. So it's like, let's have a flashback at the very end, and maybe people will be fooled into thinking that episode 7 wasn't so bad after all, and it actually had a reason and a purpose, but it really didn't. And it just felt so unsubtle. It's like, as I said, we already knew what was going on for those characters and why they were doing what they were doing. You did not need this unsubtle storytelling moment. The real strength of series 2, I think, is episode 6, 8, and 9. They really are the strength. Basically, the second half of the series, barring episode 7, which is a bit of a mess, is really where the strength of this series 2 lies. So basically what you've got here, I think, is a series of 9 episodes where really only about 4, maybe 4.5 of them have really got substantial storytelling meat on their bones. So basically, I think this could have been like a 2-hour or 2.5-hour movie, and it would have achieved everything, in fact, far more effectively than what it did over 9 episodes. And so basically what you've got is a lot of sort of unnecessary and filler and background stuff that just doesn't really add a lot and doesn't advance the story in a really enriching and rewarding kind of way for us, the viewers. So, as I said, it's not a slog. It's not something you hate. You don't get to the end of it and go, I hated this. It was awful. It's so bad. It's not like that Godfather sequel that shall not be named that was just like, what are they doing here? It was good. It was still good. And it really is saved, thankfully, by the ending. I was a bit worried halfway through. I thought, oh no, where is this going to go? But they do bring it out of the fire quite well, and they really do towards the end of it. There's some great classic little Stranger Things moments in there too that are enjoyable. I wondered to myself after watching the end of this whether what they could have actually done was made a Netflix movie, a supplementary movie, a Stranger Things film. I mean, even released it in cinemas. I think it would have got quite a following. A lot of people would have probably paid money to go and see it. But you make a film, 2 hours, 2.5 hours. You sort of tidy up a lot of the loose ends from the first series. You make a really strong 2 hour, 2.5 hour film. And then what you do is you give yourself more time to actually write the next series. So what's going to be series 3 for us, but would have been series 2 really if we had a film in the middle. And you actually create a story that is just a bit better thought out and a bit more well crafted. Go back to some of the basics that made the original series so good. Some of the subtlety, the tightness in the storytelling. You don't need to add lots of characters. You don't need the cliches. You can just focus on a good story well told. And unfortunately, Series 2, I think, didn't quite pull that off. But it's still enjoyable. It's still, I think, something, as I said, you come to the end of it, it's not a slog, you're not bored, you're not really too upset, but you are frustrated because you know it could be better, and it's more than just, as I've said, the bigotry of unmet high expectations. I'd love to know what your thoughts are, though. Have you seen it? Are you watching it? Are you partway through? Let me know in the comments section below. What did you think about Series 2? Thanks for watching. See you next time on Left Foot Media.